Today, we're going to shine a spotlight on a generation that rarely asks for attention, but quietly shapes enormous parts of Australia's economy and real estate landscape. And I'm talking about Generation X, that cohort born between 1965 and 1980. While millennials dominate the headlines and boomers dominate Australia's balance sheets, Gen X has been sitting in the middle. And as you'll hear today, they've been making some very important moves. In fact, new data suggests that Gen X are the quiet winners of Australia's property markets. They bought homes when they were more affordable. They rode an incredible rate cut cycle in the 90s and in the 2000s. They've accumulated more equity than most people realise. But here's the real story. It's what happens next that will reshape Australia's housing markets over the next decade. So welcome to this episode of Demographics Decoded, the show that unveils the trends shaping your future. I'm Michael Yardney, and each week I'm joined by leading demographer Simon Kirstenmacher, and together we dig deep beneath the data to uncover trends that are shaping our economy, our communities, and our future prosperity, and what that means for you, for your business, for your investments, and for your prosperity. And today we're talking in particular about the housing markets as well, because our aim is to help you make sense of what's coming next so you can make smarter decisions for your life. And Simon, today I'd like to explain how Gen X is entering a completely new stage of their life. They've paid down their mortgages. Many are juggling aging parents. They're still at home. Adult children are taking up their budgets a bit. They're driving the hybrid work from home patterns, but they're preparing for the biggest intergenerational wealth transfer in our nation. So let's have a bit of a talk about how Gen X are going to influence property demand, home design, all the various trends that will shape our future, Simon.
Yes, and Gen X is, of course, a bit of an underdog there, and I tend to call it the forgotten generation, the middle child, whatever it is. But it's quite interesting how they are quite achievers, how they are much better off than we might do them justice, and of course they are facing their decade. So this is an extremely Gen X heavy and super interesting decade ahead for those folks. Gen X, of course, in this sense, being defined as people born in the 60s and 70s. So you are now, this is the lot after the baby boomer generation and before the millennial generation.
Well, Simon, this generation is often described as the forgotten middle child, but as we dig into the data, it actually paints a slightly different picture. Actually are, I believe, the clients I've seen and what I've read, financially savvy, they're pragmatic, they entered the property market when things were pretty good at a good time in history. And a recent report from Cotality showed how different generations have done well over property. And the Gen Xers who bought property at their age of 25, when they were 25 in 1997 or thereabouts, have made significant gains, while boomers, who are often said, hey, they've done so well out of property, actually probably only made 2/3 of those sort of gains when they were 25 until this same sort of stage, and millennials not as much again. So I guess Gen Xers got into the property market at a time when significant growth just underpinned their equity growth.
Absolutely. And part of this is just the generational lottery. You just lucked out that things worked a bit more in your favor. And that's good. So that's good for them. And they, of course, we keep forgetting how well they've done because we don't talk about them much. We quite often focus on the most attractive generational conflict, which is boomers versus millennials. So essentially, this is the parental generation of boomers versus their kids' generation of millennials. That adds for quite a bit of drama. So just from this, theatrical perspective, this is much more attractive than quite Gen X. And of course, Gen X, really has a much higher home ownership rate than the millennials have. I know that millennial listeners, of course, would laugh at the idea of a millennial home buyer at 25. There, of course, are much fewer millennials who manage to buy a house than boomers or Gen Xers, simply because the price to income ratios of housing went up. But yeah, what you pointed at there in this Cotality report is quite nice to see that it's just this middle generation. You buy a property in the 90s and you really benefited from that because you had those rate cuts cycles and at the same time prices escalated. So that's, of course, a nice thing for you. You can remortgage, you can ride the price growth. That's cool. And then you can invest again into an investment property. because you are now well and truly a believer of the property game, and this worked for you.
Well, Gen Xers have had significant equity growth in their home. Many have paid down some or all of their mortgage as well, but they've also had extra costs. They're sometimes called the sandwich generation, Simon, because some are supporting aging parents. Others have gotten to the point now where their kids are out of school, but some are still hovering around home. So there's quite a lot of 19, 20-year-olds who are still at home with their Gen X parents.
Let's say, and of course, I'm simplifying this, but I'm always saying that Gen X is now facing a very, very rough decade financially because they still have financially dependent children. That is a severe cost. They now have to take care of their aging parents to some sort of degree, either through financial means or through actual care means, which might mean that they need to work fewer hours to pull this off. And of course, they are the generation, this is not the whole generation, but they are the generation most likely to have potentially overextended their mortgage at the last super low rate cycle during the pandemic years to benefit of the home upgrader, home package there, to maybe buy the bigger upgrader property and so forth. And so they're burning the candle from three ends for the next day. It's a weird candle, but they're burning the candle from three ends. So they have a lot of pressures for the next decade. Ultimately, as we discussed quite often on this podcast, I would forecast that property prices don't go down in the next decade and a half. So that's not a problem for these Gen Xers. But then on one random Tuesday in 10 years' time, they kick their kids out in their late 20s out of the house. They pay off the mortgage and mom, the last parent, dies. So all of a sudden, all those financial pressures that they have are gone and they have heaps of money. So there is pressure for Gen X coming one decade ahead from then onwards. They should be doing really well because just as time as your costs go down, you inherit money from the parental deaths. And so all of a sudden you're really swimming in money in the mid 2030s. Yeah, and all the
Maybe
while,
when you don't need it as much, they probably need it more today.
exactly. That's the problem. Is yes, you might still have a kid that you support through the later phases of university or something like this, but ultimately your costs are declining and your income increases. So that is it's a bit weird. What do you do with the money? You'll invest it in probably in the property market because by then prices might go down a bit because boomers die and all the boomer properties enter the market. So much more property than usual, much more existing property than usual enters the market at the same time. And I have cash as a Gen Xer then. So why wouldn't I pounce on this opportunity?
Will this actually create a need for different sort of accommodation for the next decade, though? Maybe separate living zones, studios, granny flats, dual occupancy, as we have multi-generational households. Now, we know at one extreme, there are more single people households for the generations older than the Gen X, the baby boomers whose partners are dying off. But there seems to be the requirement for more multi-generational households, including the fact that a lot of Australians have now come over the last decades from India and other countries where it's actually normal to live that way.
Absolutely. So for the next 10 years, Gen X needs gigantic houses, so to speak, because they still have kids in the house. They potentially want to have a grandparent in the house or maybe in a granny flat in the back if the property is big enough to accommodate for this. So this cohort wants a gigantic house for a little while. And of course, they want this in a middle suburb. Gen X is more likely to live in the middle suburbs than the outer suburbs at the moment. And so you go, well, that's where property is expensive. So maybe their parents have a big property that they could then remodel and align up for those new needs. But you see that there is quite a bit of work that needs to be done to make properties ready for this new stage of the life cycle or to purchase a property that is large enough to accommodate for this. And so that means that Gen X, even though they are slowly moving out of the family stage of the life cycle, might potentially increase the demand for family-sized housing, which puts house prices up, which puts more pressure on the young first home buyers who go, boy, yet another kind of market cohort that competes for the type of family-sized property that I would like to have. Yeah, that's what Gen X wants in the next decade. Then again, the parents die, the kids move out. I think that Gen X as a generation will be much more likely to downsize at this point than previous generations were, because Gen X is this famously pragmatic generation that is much more likely to look at research that talks about downsizing as a financial win for people, as an opportunity to move into an extremely walkable neighborhood, maybe even a retirement living facility, because this is linked, walkability in particular, is linked to positive mental health outcomes in old age. It's massive, the difference. If you look at the happiness of old people in walkable communities versus unwalkable communities, it's gigantic. So we report poor mental health at 3 times the rate in the most extreme unwalkable neighborhoods, because social isolation is aided by this, and that's really bad for your mental health, blah, blah, blah. So that's the argument where you'd say in the mid-2030s onwards, these Gen Xers might actually seriously be looking at downsizing properties in walkable, attractive destinations.
One of the things that may stop them, though, is stamp duty. If they have a $2 million house at today's stamp duty rates, they're going to end up having to probably pay a couple of $100,000 of wasted money. It's going to make them think twice about this. But we've discussed on previous shows how stamp duty is a disincentive, but it's also cocaine to the government's coffers.
Exactly. And they will make those decisions much less from a gut feeling perspective than from a pragmatic perspective. So this is much more a spreadsheet heavy generation than the boomers were. Boomers make more emotional, value driven decisions, but I think Gen X will be taking the strategic approach, with financial being a big source of the calculations.
Well, another thing that's going to affect the sort of housing Gen Xers are going to require, Simon, is the fact that 34% of remote workers are Gen X. I'm not saying 34% of Gen X are remote workers, but in fact, all those who do work remotely, hybrid work is really the way a lot of people are doing it nowadays. Gen X are the biggest generation involved in that, which means they're going to need, I remember the early days of COVID and the Zoom calls when cats used to walk by and kids used to interrupt you. That's unacceptable nowadays. You need a separate home office space, don't you?
Yes, absolutely. And Gen X, well and truly, is the working from home generation because they obsess so much about work-life balance. So you want to think a bit about the history of Gen X. First generation where both parents worked. So the latchkey generation comes home to an empty house, is raised by afternoon television. Parents have them on a long leash. And it's the last really free generation there because we didn't have a nation-spanning childcare network at this point. For later generations, we introduced the childcare network. So they were raised by themselves, turned them pragmatic, to a certain degree cynical, but they have that in mind. They know, because they saw both parents work themselves to death, that there must be a better way. And so they obsess about work-life balance. And they figured out how good working from home is, because you you cut out a bit of commuting time. You use this time for your family time, the hobbies that you have, whatever it is. That's cool. So Gen X will favor this. This, of course, means, yet another driver that says Gen X need bigger rather than smaller houses.
They're also probably going to want to, live in different locations, work from home in different locations. As you said a moment ago, Simon, lifestyle is very important for them. And many are actually buying second homes, aren't they, in areas where they can commute?
Yeah, and so that's the idea of where you see these secondary hubs, regional centers in what I would consider extreme commuting distance benefit. And the idea is, well, I can buy bigger property, I can have a calmer lifestyle, work remotely, engage in my hobbies, and suck it up once a week and go to the office. So that's a big strategy for Gen X. The millennials can't do it so much because they don't have financial resources that they can borrow against. And boomers, they sit in cushiony, large homes, many of them in attractive destinations. They don't need to do that either. But so this is a bit of a Gen X game at the moment, this whole regional second home, maintain the home in the city and so forth game. It's a part-time lifestyler purchaser. That's Gen X for now.
Now, Simon, I know you do a lot of work on demographic trends and intergenerational trends. By the way, if you find this interesting, Simon and I have had a lot of chats in each episode of Demographics Decoded about how the different generations communicate, how they think. So if you're a business owner, or if you have employees or staff you look after, or if you're an investor wanting to know how people are going to want to live, if you don't currently subscribe to this show, click the subscribe or follow button, and on your podcast app, click automatic download, so once a week you get our shows so you can listen to this, but you can go back to previous shows to understand how these trends are going to affect you as a business owner or as an investor. Now, Simon, I want to talk a bit about the Gen Xers and their wealth and what it means for the future. But before we do, this is what you do day and night, isn't it, as a demographer, to understand how these trends are going to affect businesses?
That is very much what I do. And so I present at big conferences, at events, at boardrooms. And quite often I see a room full of Gen Xers look back at me at those events, because Gen X is now dominating the top leadership positions. Yeah, you become prime minister at 54, CEO at 52 in Australia. And so when I speak at a leadership type event, this is Gen X that I'm talking to. And it's quite interesting to see how these demographic and generational narratives are now mirrored in business and leadership decisions. So there is a clear connection. And it's part of the things that I'm discussing, also discussing much more hard population data rather than the value-driven narratives. But that's what I do. Tell businesses what their world looks like from the demographic perspective.
If you're interested in having Simon speak to your company, organization, your institution, I'm going to leave a link in the show notes for the demographics group where you can get in contact with him. Now, you're also going to be speaking at Wealth Retreat in the last weekend of May on the Gold Coast to a group of successful business people and entrepreneurs. We've done this for quite a number of years. You've been the keynote speaker, and you really wow people. So while they get a taste of you here on our podcast, being able to see you and experience you live has been a great part of our event. Go to wealthretreat.com.au and find out more about it. And whether you're a Gen X or whatever generation you are, we're spending a lot of time talking about property at the moment. At Metropole, we help our clients to safely secure their financial future by growing a property portfolio that's safe, secure, outperforms the markets, and they can pass it on to future generations. But we start by putting a plan together for you to help you plan to become the investor you plan to become. So go to metropole.com.au, leave a link in the show notes, and we'd love to help you take advantage of the property markets in 2026. Now, Simon, some people who are going to take advantage of the property markets in 2026 and beyond the next decade are really the Gen Xers. They're going to be the first generation that are going to retire with compulsory super. My generation of baby boomers, super was in from when I was young. It was not compulsory. I remember years ago, it was hard in my teens to put money aside for in my 60s. I thought I needed the money more at that time, but I do remember my accountant Stan at the time said, no, keep it in, and I'm glad I did. But baby boomers are going to pass on their inheritance, like we said. The Gen Xers are going to have the compulsory super. Boy, they're going to be very well positioned financially.
They should be. As a whole, there's not too much to worry about. The downside risk, of course, is that banks are still worried about Gen X the most of all generations, because there are quite a few in there with those super maxed out mortgages where if something were to go wrong, they're concerned about them. But as a whole, the generation should be fine. As you said, this is the first cohort who paid into their super account throughout their whole career. So they retire with a maxed out super based on what they earned, unless they put additional money into their super. But so that's fine. So that's another safety there. They still have decent home ownership rates, so that's helpful. And they will now soon. So the amount of money that they inherit will be higher than it was for previous generations, and that benefits them. And now Gen X, because they still view themselves as a generation that is pragmatic, I think they will be more likely to downsize into townhouses, apartments. So I think the downsizer market will be bigger in relative terms in the Gen X cohort than it was or is right now in the boomer cohort. So that market should probably increase rather than decrease. In relative size, everything increases because we grow the country as a whole. I think they will demand quality because they have, when it comes to stuff like retirement living and so forth, they want quality, but they also want low maintenance. I don't see them as overly keen to just look after their house, their stuff. So a bit more pragmatic in old age than previous generations, and the property market will mirror it.
Now, interestingly, baby boomers at the moment are in general called the bank of mum and dad, giving money to their children and grandchildren. But in 10 years' time, as the baby boomers of many of them have died off, Gen Xers will be in that position. They'll be in a very good position to be able to pass the inheritance forward.
Exactly. And I think they are even more pragmatic than boomers are. because they will, if a Gen Xer looks at their, or it's the case for every family, if you have money to spare to hand down to the bank of mom and dad, it is for the whole family unit a very attractive proposition, because we know if a mortgage costs 5.3% on average over 30 years, you pay exactly twice the amount of the mortgage to the bank. So a $500,000 mortgage means $1 million to the bank. And that, of course, means that if you give $100,000 to your kids, you actually get $200,000 worth of financial benefit out of it. And so if you think about these kind of, and if interest rates are higher, the benefit is even bigger. And so a Gen X parent couple, they will look at this and go, it's worth it. So they will much more be likely to be sitting there with a calculator rather than just a gut feel fairness type approach. And I think their kids will benefit from it. And so their kids, of course, are the current Gen Zs. These are the young people entering the workforce right now that we complain about. These people actually have more advantages on the property market than they currently feel. I'm not saying it's easy for them, but it will be less bad for them than it would be for the millennials, for example.
So looking forward over the next decade or so, Gen Xers are going to influence the premium suburbs of our capital city because they've got the money to do that, and they're going to want to live in the right sort of homes, often right sizing, as you say, to apartments and townhouses. They're also probably going to buy that secondary home and get away because they appreciate lifestyle more. Their decisions are going to shape our property markets over the next decade, Simon, more than other generations in some ways. But
Yes.
quietly, because we keep talking about the millennials moving into family
Yeah.
formation stage, the
No, no.
baby boomers downsizing. So I thought it was worth just remembering Gen Xers are out there too.
Exactly, and we underestimate them. We even underestimate them from a political perspective. Are they able to shape the political spectrum if they are a small generation sandwiched between two big generations? And the hilarious answer is they are, because there was such little migration into their bit in the 70s. The Gen Xers that are here are pretty Aussie, meaning they are voters. So they are making up a bigger voter block than we do them justice from a market perspective. So if you sell to one cohort, your cereal, your t-shirts, Gen X isn't nearly as important as millennials and boomers, but from a political perspective, they are just as, if not even a tiny bit more important.
Well, they make up a lot of CEOs and business owners and leaders in politics and industry.
That, of course, too, because they now finally reached their mid-50s, which is top leadership age in Australia. And so they're not just a cohort that is bigger in politics than we might do justice from a voter perspective, but they are also the politicians who make the decisions. So why wouldn't you make political decisions in favor of the cohort that you kind of sort of understand?
So thanks. It was an interesting conversation as always. By the way, if you found this interesting as a viewer or listener, just do Simon and me a favor. We only ask one favor of you. Tell somebody else about the show. We love seeing how our subscriber numbers keep increasing. And the aim of this is just to make people more informed about what's ahead for their futures. That's the aim of Demographics Decoded. So please just click every podcast app or YouTube if you're watching has a share button. Tell somebody about it. So I guess in summary, Simon, Gen Xers are going to quietly shape Australian real estate. They have for 30 years and they're going to keep doing that over the next decade. We're probably going to see how influential they really are.
Yes, and they will be very influential. Spoiler alert.
Thanks. I look forward to catching up with you next week.
Awesome. I'll see you next week.
This Demographics Decoded podcast has been brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Just go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property advisory, wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team at Metropole will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades, and we've been helping clients with for well over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. In between these Demographics Decoded shows, you can follow me on social media, and I suggest you also follow Simon Kirstenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all social media platforms. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody who may also benefit, please tell them about Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to be shaping their future. And of course, if you don't currently subscribe, we'd love you to. And of course, any of the information that we've been sharing with you is general information because we don't know your specific circumstances.